Dear friends, today we celebrate the feast day of two great apostles, Saints Peter and Paul. Most of the apostles and lot of saints have their own feast day. But how about the two most famous saints of the early church? Saint Augustine says, both apostles shared the same feast day, for these two were one. And even though they suffered on different days, they were as one. Peter went first and Paul followed. These two disciples are considered two great pillars of the early church, and they are celebrated together. Apart from the fact that they both were zealous missionaries of the early church, they hardly have anything in common. Let's take a look at Saint Peter. He is one of the 12, one of the disciples of Jesus, whom Jesus directly chose at the start of his public ministry. Therefore, he is an eyewitness to the most important events in the life of Jesus. However, it's a great comfort for ordinary people like us to know that Peter also had his human weaknesses, even in the presence of Jesus. He generously gave up all things, yet he can ask in childish self-regard, what are we going to get for all these? Mathew chapter 19:27. He receives the full force of Christ's anger when he objects to the idea of a suffering Messiah. Get behind me, Satan. You are an obstacle to me. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do. Matthew chapter 16:23. Peter is willing to accept Jesus' doctrine of forgiveness, but he suggests a limit of 7 times. He walks on the water in faith, but sinks in doubt. He refuses to let Jesus wash his feet, then wants his whole body cleansed. He swears at the Last Supper that he will never deny Jesus, and then swears to a servant girl that he has never known the man. He loyally resists the first attempt to arrest Jesus by cutting off Malchus' ear, but in the end, he runs away with the others. However, in the depth of his sorrow, Jesus looks on him and forgives him, and he goes out and sheds bitter tears. The risen Jesus told Peter to feed his lambs and his sheep, John chapter 21, 15-17, thus transferring his authority to Peter. What made Peter a suitable candidate for Jesus' call was his love. So 3 times Jesus asked him if he loved him and asked him to look after the flock. The experience and recognition of his frailty makes Saint Peter a compassionate leader after the heart of Jesus. Now, Saint Paul, on the other hand, was a man of conviction, and he would leave no stone unturned to put into practice what he thought was the right thing, both before his conversion and after his conversion. Paul was a controversial character in his own way. He had a fiery personality. In his early life, he channeled that fire towards persecuting the Christians in Jerusalem, even witnessing the death of Stephen. Acts chapter 8 verse 1. Paul was not fortunate enough to meet the earthly Jesus, but that singular experience on the way to Damascus changed everything for Paul. We can say that Peter and his other disciples learned in 3 years what Paul learned in a moment of direct revelation, in a moment of meeting the risen Lord. After this, he spent about 10 years in Tarsus before he began his preaching ministry. It was a time for him to cool down and to experience the deeper meaning and significance of the death and resurrection of Jesus. We can ask today, why did God call Paul? Paul was a highly educated Pharisee, and it would be only someone like him who could see that faith in Jesus demanded a totally new perspective on life and a completely new relationship with God. Paul's experience of the risen Jesus on the way to Damascus was the driving force that made him one of the most zealous, dynamic, and courageous ambassadors of Christ. But persecutions and humiliations became his mode of carrying the daily cross and source for further transformation. The dying Christ was in him. The living Christ was his life. He says, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me." Dear friends, as we look at the personalities of Peter and Paul, we see that God called each of them to use their personalities and talents to spread the gospel. Peter to use his impulsive love to look after the sheep, and Paul to use his training as a Pharisee and his strength of character and his insights to ensure that the non-Jews would be welcomed into the church. It's a reminder to us that our talents and our weaknesses too can become God's means of helping others if we let Him do that. We don't have to be perfect for God to work through us. God can work through us as He did with Paul and Peter in spite of our frailties and weaknesses. Dear friends, as we celebrate this day made holy for us by the blood of the apostles Peter and Paul, let's ask the grace to embrace what they believed, embrace their lifestyle, their labors, their sufferings, their preaching, and finally, their confession of faith.